We'd start with pacing the audio and making it like at the pace of a This American Life story. Because typically when someone comes into the booth and reads a story, or like we jump between narration and tape. When I say tape, I just mean like ambi or like interview audio or on location audio or something like that. When we're jumping between those two things, we want to make sure it's not like too fast in the transitions or whatever. So that's pacing is the first thing we do.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast life. Today I am joined by Mike Comite, and we are going to talk all about what goes into mixing a podcast. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Always happy to talk to you and happy to be on one of your shows, one of your many, many shows.
Well, this is going to be my only show as far as personal projects go for a while. But to kick things off, could you explain what your role is at This American Life?
Sure. The website, This American Life website says I'm a senior mixer, which sort of sounds like a bartender position. But I guess in my head, I've kind of reformatted that to this being the senior mix engineer or just the mix engineer. I don't feel very senior, but so that my role here is to mix audio for the show, and that encompasses a lot of different things, which I'm sure we'll get to talking to down the line in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So senior mixer kind of gives off the sound that there is a team that you work with, and it's not just you mixing the show on your own, right?
Right. I am the only full-time dedicated mixer. There are other mixers on the show, but I am the only person on the team with like a dedicated role that is only mixer. The other mixers on the team we have some part-time mixers, and we have a production coordinator who is also a mixer, and then we have a technical director, Matt. He's also a mixer on the show. And then all the producers are pretty capable as far as mixing goes too, but they shifted the mixing responsibilities over to a dedicated mixing team of those individuals I just mentioned, because their jobs are very all-encompassing as a producer, and it helped to offload the audio responsibilities to somebody else.
So being part of a team, what are the moving parts that you're working with? I know you and I have talked before, and we've talked sound design, working with a composer. Are you sort of the one coordinating a lot of that as the senior mixer?
I wouldn't say I'm coordinating it. I definitely am taking part in all of it. And in the last 6 months, I've actually, my manager, Stowe, he's the production coordinator here at the show. He's been on parental leave. So I actually stepped into his role for the last 6 months. So I did get a taste of the coordination part of the job in terms of like, making sure that everybody was working on the right stories, or just basically lining up all the different parts. But as a mixer, I want to just talk in like the role that I was signed up for and the role that I'm going back to next week, actually, which is just as the mixer. And as far as the moving parts for that goes, it's really mostly just related to my coworkers that I'm functioning with. Like there's the producers who are writing the stories and going out and reporting the stories, and the contributors as well who are coming in and narrating those stories sometimes. There's a team of people, the team of producers and editors called the Mix Noters on our staff, who are the people who take the mixes that I make and give me feedback on them. And then there's other mixers on the team who I'm, juggling different projects with, asking them to take over my mix if I can't do something or if I get pulled into something else. So yeah, those are the moving parts that we're dealing with. And then there's like smaller moving parts, I think, that aren't really a huge part of my day-to-day, but make up like, once every week, once every 2 weeks, which is music supervision duties, which, I work with probably 3 or 4 composers. I'm commissioning music for the show by way of them, giving them feedback on pieces that they send to me and kind of saying like, hey, could we make this section longer? Could you bring a higher register melody here? Or this instrument's not working? Things like that. And there's So those are like composers, coworkers are really just my moving parts at this show.
Yeah. And you hosted a podcast called Bantha Fodder, which is all about Star Wars, with our friend Jacob Tender.
Yeah.
And I was curious, how does mixing a podcast by yourself differ from having a whole team that you're working with?
Well, they're very different podcasts. Bantha, I appreciate you reaching all the way back into the ye old years of 2016. I don't think Jacob and I have made an episode of that show in a couple of years now, since like it was like season 2 of like The Mandalorian, I think was the last thing we talked about.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it's been a while. They're very different shows. Like ours is a narrative-driven show with short stories. Our whole show is 59 minutes at This American Life, and that's made up of smaller parts. And whereas Bantha Fodder, sometimes we would go like 3 hours talking about Star Wars to many people's chagrin. And that was just of two guys talking on mics with that show initially. Like, I think I did get into a lot of sound design stuff. The differences to me are really just the focus of something and the idea that you are trying to tell a story as opposed to have a discussion. Like, I don't know. It's weird because like in our stories, we're trying to have a discussion or shed light on something or take you from point A to B. And I guess we're doing the same thing on Bantha Fodder. We were doing the same thing on Bantha Fodder in those conversations. But mixing it was really just a very solitary task. Listening through, looking for edit points and shortening things down and, doing very minimal processing and learning about things. But when it comes to what I do in my show now, This American Life, like what I'm mixing has been handed to me. That's the biggest difference in what I'm doing. Like I was going through Jake and my audio and trimming it down and making cuts here and there and monitoring for content. Whereas what I've been given is just what I need to work with. A lot of time, the changes I'm making are very minimal. Whereas, I was making very big executive changes with Bantha Fodder.
Yeah. Is there any sort of pressure for you when you're mixing a show as big as This American Life, which is also an award-winning show and so many other things because it has been going so long and has so many listeners?
I think it could very, very, very easily become that like kind of high pressure situation with like that prestige that comes with the show. But it definitely could be that, but it is not that. And the reason it's not that is because my coworkers are all very, very chill here. Like the people that I work with are like, they're not, I guess I can't speak for them, but it doesn't seem like they're focused on winning awards and things like that. They're not like the awards that happen are like just the result of like people really focused on making good work no matter what. And they're not like under pressure to do good work because of like the millions of people listening or whatever. They're doing because they really, really care about what they do and they are great and talented at what they do too. So because they are so chill about these things and just like making jokes about it and like the most pressure I feel is on a Friday night because we are, we're doing a podcast show right now, like this is the podcast life, but we are like This American Life is a radio show first and foremost. And we have, because we're on the radio, we have a hard deadline on Friday nights and it has to come out at this time because it's literally going onto the air. And if we don't go onto the air at 8 p.m. on Friday nights, there's just dead air and people are paying money for that and would essentially cost us. So that's the pressure that I feel working on a show like this. And it has nothing to do with any awards we may or may not have won or like the type of stories we're reporting on. It's truly just the pressures of radio in general.
To a lesser extent, I have some of that with a couple of the political podcasts that I work on. They don't go to radio, but everything is same day turnaround because they're recording the episodes the day before, going live the next day. So it's like everything is on a deadline. Depending on which one I'm working on, one of them has to go like get approval from the publication that posts the podcasts. And it's just like a whole different beast when you're doing stuff that has hard deadlines versus, yes, my other podcasts have like dates they want to go up, but sometimes I have stuff months in advance and it just makes a world of difference not having to rush everything that I work on.
Well, yeah, I mean, working in news is nuts because like sometimes you have that. Yeah, it's just like a story has to go out in that time. You can't, afford to punt it at all. We have to all scramble. And it's like, normally we're doing these shows like months, like these stories that we're reporting on are like, a year, 6 months, a month at least, sometimes in advance. But a lot of times it just pops up last second too.
So what is your process like when you are mixing? Do you handle dialogue first, music first? Do you have a specific way you approach it?
Yeah, there is a process. I think it's constantly changing for me, and I'm trying to find new ways to optimize it. But yeah, the general process that I have is we would start with pacing the audio and making it like at the pace of a This American Life story. Because typically when someone comes into the booth and reads a story, or like we jump between narration and tape. When I say tape, I just mean like ambi or like interview audio or on location audio or something like that. When we're jumping between those two things, we want to make sure it's not like too fast in the transitions or whatever. And so that's pacing is the first thing we do. Second thing would be leveling and coming in and making sure we're hitting our loudness standards. We have a show, this show for radio, our loudness standards are negative 24 LUFS. That's radio in general. And then for podcast, we are very conservative in our levels. We hit a negative 18 LUFS, whereas I think the standard is negative 16 and pushing upwards now. And we're talking about changing that as we integrate more ads into our show on the podcast side of things. But yeah, so that's leveling as a second step. After that comes scoring, where I bring in music from our library or another external music library like APM or Blue Dot, Stellwagen. Like just, yeah, there's other libraries out there that we use. And we put the music to the show. And then I guess this is not necessarily the mix, like that's the mix process that I just described to you, those 3 steps. But then further into my mixing process that I have as a mixer at this show is that then we send the story over to the mix noters that I mentioned earlier. They listen to the story and they say, this music cue works here. Can we start it a little bit earlier? I don't like this cue. Can you try something else? Let's use your alternate here. Those things. And then they kick the mix back to me. I do the fixes or whatever changes need to be made. And usually around that time, we're getting retracts in from the narrator, who is, then we have to find a way to bring in those retracts. And that retracts process can be very simple sometimes if it's large swaths of a passage that's being retracked. But if it's like lines within a larger passage, it can be more difficult because, as you probably know, even if it's the same person, same mic, same room, they could be really close to the mic or they could be really far away from it while they're tracking. They may not be keeping that good 1 fist distance from the mic at all times. And so you can definitely get that, like, how do I match this one word in this sentence to the rest of the sentence around it? And it becomes that's like the crazy hassle at the end of the day.
Yeah, I've worked with hosts who like to move around a lot. So they'll be further from the mic and then closer. And then it's like I have to cut a bunch of stuff in between. So it goes from really loud to really quiet. And thankfully, I don't have to mix those. So that's not my headache. I just do the editing on some shows.
Lucky. Do you ever have like a strategy in your head of like, I would approach it this way if I was mixing this? Like,
I am guilty of just kind of trying to bump up the gain on clips to level it out and see if, it matches that way. Sometimes tonally it doesn't match though. So it's like, you can tell like they sound really loud and excited in the first half. And then it gets like more somber in the second half. And you're just like, oh, there's not a whole lot you can do about that in particular. But yeah, usually for me, I just try to like level out as much as possible. And I'm like, well, you can tell there's an edit here. And sometimes that it is just what it is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I don't do nearly as much mixing as you. So for me, I keep things pretty simple, like level things out, use some compression, and then like denoise whatever I have to. But then I kind of just toss a limiter on it at the end. And I'm like, great. Yeah. This is around, like you said, the standard is minus 16 LUFS, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's basically how loud your podcast is. And there are plenty of like free meters you can use when you're mixing an episode to figure out what levels you're hitting. When I first started, I had no clue what that was. And I like went to Pod News, I think it was, and I looked up my shows and they were like, this show is too quiet. So you're probably destroying someone's ears when they switch to something else.
I wasn't sure if I should get into like the nitty gritty details of how we mix or something. I just wanted to go like the base level, the top level. But like when it comes to the loudness standards, like we've only probably been adhering, like This American Life has probably only been adhering to those loudness standards since like 2018 or so. And the show has been around for 25 years, so it's a funny thing. Like I remember back when I started in podcasting, I was really curious when I was learning about the levels, much like you, and I would drag like an episode of Radiolab into my loudness software and just like my loudness meters, and it'd be like, oh, like this thing is going above unity here. Like you're clipping on like this show is clipping. It's it's not even close to like no 2 episodes were the same loudness. Some of them were too loud, some of them were too quiet, some of them went clipped, and it was just like, oh, like they're not really caring about that stuff. And that's true. Like a lot of people, that I work with don't really pay attention to the audio side of things. And that's why I think they did build out that dedicated mixing team, because they're like, okay, we got to start hitting some standards here. Like we're getting some feedback from networks or like not networks, but radio stations. And so it helps to have somebody at least on the staff who knows, what our target is.
Yeah, I personally prefer -18. Like, yeah, I feel like for my ears, that's like just a nice loudness to even just edit at, you know? So I'm just always like, do I really need to bump it up to -16? And then when you get into video
Oh,
and
yeah.
all of this other stuff, I'm just like, I'm just keeping it relatively the same. And then I just have like my output capped at, I think it's -6 for video and -2, I think I do for podcasts.
Yeah. We don't really, we have, so I guess this is something that I feel like anybody listening to this might be interested in if you're mixing podcasts or radio or whatever. Like This American Life as a show does not use compression. And that's
Fascinating.
yeah, so that's a really, we don't have any outboard compressors either in our studios or anything like that. So when I talked about leveling earlier, we are leveling the entire show by hand, only by volume automation, and not even with like a fader or something like that. Like we're clicking and drawing, and we're not like level writing or anything like that. We don't use any vocal writers, although they would make my life a lot easier probably. I've tried it before, and honestly, the human touch is a lot better than any vocal writer I've tried. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. We have a master on the master bus. We do have one Maxim is the stock limiter in Pro Tools, and we use that as a ceiling and like a brick wall limiter. And if you actually look at it, it's really not doing much limiting. It's just there as a safeguard. I have opinions on it, you know. Like I think our threshold is too low on it. I think sometimes because we, you know, if you mix too close to that threshold, you'll get some pumping effects. But that typically doesn't happen. So, but yeah, that is the only semblance of compression. And the reason for that, besides my boss's preferences, is really just that, like I mentioned earlier, we're a radio show first and foremost. So I don't know when the last time anybody who's hearing this has listened to This American Life on the radio, but you know, many of our listeners do. And at 8 p.m. on Friday nights, we tune in like through the live stream on WBEZ's website, and I've listened to our live stream there, and because it is a radio program, radio stations use extreme limiting, like brick wall to the max. You know, it's just end-to-end compression. So if we were to use compression on our show, I can't even imagine how much worse it would sound. Just to be clear, I think I love the radio. I'm in love with that compressed sound. Like I think it's a very nostalgic sound for me to hear like a Howard Stern type voice just like super squashed into my speakers, and like the kind of the hiss and the line noise of a studio, like with people talking and everything, and just like the EQ settings that radio stations will put on their signals as they're going out or whatever. But yeah, like if we were to use compression on our end of things, like it would just be so much like less dynamic and on the radio, and it would just make for a way worse listening experience. So yeah, so that is kind of like the reason why we don't use it here, is just because if we were to compress, it would sound way worse.
Yeah, you don't need that double compression with the radio show.
I do love that sound. Like, it adds this like warmth to it that like you just don't get coming out of the speakers or the headphones when we're mixing it, and it's just like this. It's this. I guess it's basically mastering, right? It's like when a musician sends their track in for mastering or something like that. It gives it like this finalized warmth, and like it makes it seem legitimate in a way that like, you know, it's like this. It's like a filter on like a camera or something like that. It just adds this gloss to it that is, or like this color saturation that you're just like, oh wow, this is a radio program now. It's like before it wasn't, now it is, and that's kind of what I like about the way we mix here, as time consuming as it can be. Like I think I've tried in the past, like my first year here when I was really like pushing back against the whole mixing by hand thing, I would like jump in and do my regular mixing process, which is like, you know, throwing a couple like light compressors on it and just, you know, doing like very minimal hand automation. And I was like, this took me 15 minutes to mix this story, you know, like, and it takes me like an hour to mix it the other way, you know, and they're like, we don't care, like just do it our way. And then my mind was wiped and I was brainwashed, and now I fully believe in the hand automation. I couldn't do it for like a 3-hour podcast though. Like if you're editing like a 2-hour podcast or something like that, I mean, the stories I'm mixing are anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes long, you know, so that is a different beast than mixing an entire hour-long show by hand or 2-hour-long show. Very different.
Yeah, we've talked podcasts a lot, and I definitely work at a much higher volume than you do. Like,
Yes, you
I
do.
have frequently mentioned to you that I'm very jealous that you just get to work on one episode a week. And I'm over here sometimes doing like 15
Not
in
even
one
one
week.
episode. It's like I'm like maybe 15 minutes a week of a show. You're like, hour 7 or 8 of like like cumulative of the amount of audio you've touched. It's crazy.
Sometimes, yeah, I think I get through 3 to 5 hours worth of content in a day sometimes. So, like I said, I don't mix all of that necessarily. There are some shows that I'm strictly just the editor on. They get passed off to the producer and he mixes them. But for the other stuff, like you said, it's just so long that if I sat there and tried to like automate every single level, it would take so long.
That's what compressors are for. I mean, there can be tasteful compression. I'm sure there's a happy medium that we could find at the show that would, make our jobs faster and also please the ears of everybody else. But it is funny, like, like the people who have been around at this show for, like 20 years, they'll be like, is there compression on this? Like if it sounds, if they hear pumping artifact in the limiter at the end of the chain, they'll be like, it sounds too compressed. And it's like, if it sounds loud to them, it sounds compressed. That's kind of what they equate it with. And like really, truly, our master bus limiter is just there to bring it to loudness without having to crank up the automation like too far, the volume automation. It's just, but like, when it's louder, it becomes frustrating for them, especially when they go back to do those retracts and the limiter's on there and they're like, why do I sound so loud when I'm talking into the microphone? And it's like, oh, it's because the limiter's on at the end of the chain. They're like, never use that. We're like, okay, well, we have to use that. It's just it's part of the job.
It'll be there. We just won't tell you about it anymore.
Yeah.
So what's the one thing you wish you knew about mixing sooner?
It's less of a thing I found out and more a thing I came to realize, which is that there's really like the standards beyond a loudness standard. There is no one way to do it. And I think I know that's sort of a cop-out answer, but like it is the truth that there's no one way to mix a podcast. And, you could spend hours of your life, days of your life altogether, like just pouring through Reddit threads and hearing people ask, should I denoise first and then should I put compression on, and like when should I EQ in the process? And it's like there's no right answer to this, and it truly it's what sounds good to you. And you can get feedback on any of your mixes, and somebody can say like, hey, like I think if you tried it this way it'd be a little bit better. Like if you clip gained up before you compressed, it would sound a little bit better. Or if you EQ'd before your clip gain, then it would sound better. Like there are certain things that you can do, but in general, nobody but the mixers care about that stuff. And I can't express how many pieces of audio, like badly recorded audio we've had come through this show that we're like appalled by, and then we show it to somebody by like we just do a slight EQ on it, and they're just like, oh my god, you made it sound so much better. Like, or like if we're like embarrassed to show something because of how bad the audio is, they're like, oh, this sounds pretty good. Yeah, this is good. And like just nobody besides them, like the rest of the world, the real world, we'll call them. They don't care. Yeah. They don't care about what we do. They may be impressed by like the way we use music or like the way we can improve something that they've given us, but they don't care that we use the EQ. They don't care that we use the plugin. They don't care that we denoised it. Like it's all this stuff that happens, and like they appreciate it, but it doesn't matter how we do it. And
yeah,
there's just no right way to do it. And so I guess like if I was to actually pull like an actual thing I knew sooner, it would be like, you don't have to spend money on plugins. You don't have to like stock plugins are so good now. They're amazing. Like yeah, Pro Tools' interfaces are pretty outdated in their stock plugins, but they're functionally the same as most other things. And Logics are amazing. You don't need to spend money on plugins. Aim to spend the least money as amount of money as you can on your career. Make somebody else pay for it. That's kind of what I learned.
That's the real tip there.
Yeah.
Make someone else pay for it.
Yeah, don't spend your own money on stuff. Spend somebody else's money.
That said, I will live and die by my FabFilter plugins.
Oh my God. I have such a bad rep here. So you and the audience didn't get to see this earlier because we weren't tracking, but I had the technical director, Matt, and he was in here. He was just helping me out, setting up my board here. He rags on me so much and calls me a FabFilter shill because I truly, like you, will live and die by my FabFilter plugins. They are so like, when I talk about how Pro Tools plugins are like the interface is outdated or whatever. Like FabFilter is just so much better in terms of like what they do. And like they're very efficient too, like for plugins, but they do, like, you do notice a change. If I use the stock EQ in Pro Tools on a thing and I use the FabFilter Pro Q3 on it, then like I see my bounce speed changes for sure. Not a ton, but like, maybe it might get halved or something like that, which that can take time if you're bouncing something large. Yeah, but I love FabFilter. That's like the only money I've spent in mixing, and it's almost been 10 years that I've been doing this. And FabFilter, I think, just their Pro Suite is like the only thing I've spent money on. And I bought RX once. I bought RX-7 once, and I spent so much money on it because I had started making money in podcasting. Not a lot, but like I was making income podcasting on top of my regular 9-to-5 retail job. And I was like, oh, I have some extra money now. Like, I'm going to spend money on this software that will help me. And it did help me. And it was like great. And then when I started working here at This American Life, like I said, I work with a company that can afford these things and has managed to update RX to the point where we need to. RX-11 just came out a few months ago and I saw no need to update. I don't know if anybody else is feeling the same way, but RX-10 is doing just fine for me.
I believe I'm still on RX-9, but yeah, aside from FabFilter, the only other plugins I have purchased have been more along the repair lines. So
like what? Anything interesting that I should know about?
It's mostly the RX stuff. Like, I use voice denoise all the time just because there's like a little hum in the background or something. And Waves clarity is another one that I use when there's like severe background noise. So it kind of does a pretty good job of isolating the people who are like talking into the microphones and just like cutting out some of the other noise, or like when really loud sirens go by and it's like, oh, well, can't do anything about that. So it does help with that. I'm not the best at using a lot of these tools because, like I said, I don't do a lot of the mixing. I am lucky enough to work on podcasts that can afford to like go into a studio and record, especially the ones that are doing video now. They'll just like pop into a studio in Times Square, which that can still get a little loud because it's Times Square, but for the most part, like, the rooms are pretty good. So I don't have to do like a ton of repair on a bunch of stuff. Usually it's when it's like remote recordings and you have no control over like what someone else is doing.
Yeah. I think on our end, we're just using, we use RX voice denoise usually as an insert. And mouth declick comes in quite a bit, I think, just because we have some smacky talkers here, some smacky dehydrated talkers, much like I am probably right now.
So along those lines too, what would your advice be to someone who wants to get into the weeds with mixing, but they're not surrounded by a team and they're just trying to do it on their own?
I think something that is really underestimated is like searching for like mentorship and knowledge and things like that. So like you can get into the weeds, I think, in a lot of different ways. Like there are a lot of people like you and I who want to talk about podcasting and talk about mixing and like those philosophies and like save people the headache of going out there and testing a bunch of different plugins and spending a lot of money and, spending a lot of time mixing that they don't need to be mixing. And so like that's one way like that is not like a technical skill or something like that, is to like reach out to people in the community who you admire. Like if you listen to a podcast, even if it's like a chat podcast or something like that, like, just find out who their producer is. And like, we're like, I'm not a celebrity, not even close. Will never be. Like my big boss, Ira Glass, like he is a celebrity to an extent, and like he might be harder to get a hold of, so don't email him. But like there are like even the producers at our show, like they're happy to talk to people, like they may not always have time for it, but like if they do and they're like intrigued by somebody emailing them, they're like, oh yeah, I'd love to chat with this person about what it's like to be a reporter or like how to get good tape in the field. And like I can't speak for my other mixer colleagues, but like, I mean, maybe I feel confident enough to speak to Ray's opinion on this. Ray is Catherine Raimondo. She's a mixer at the show. Also, she, I think she loves talking about mixing with people, and she does a lot of outreach things. I guess to answer your question, just like mentorship and like reaching out and asking people what their thoughts are on something, and like being respectful of their time and not asking to like meet with them once a week or whatever for free or something. But like, if you have a question, like looking for good resources, like Third Coast or something like that, and that like give you connections and ways to, because like that's the people I'm meeting with. They're just like, some of them like, how do I make a podcast? Or like, I don't know how to like do signal flow and things like that. So yeah, just like look for resources. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't feel like you're doing it alone, even if you are by yourself and don't have a huge team or something. Like you have a huge community of people, but don't get bogged down by the noise in that. Like, don't get bogged down by the people telling you what gear to buy or what order to do things in or how to mix or things like that. That's the waste of time. Focus on like people that are doing things that you are impressed by or that you would like to do, and beeline for them, and go to the conventions and talk to those people. But also like, don't ignore the people too that are like you and wanting to learn. Like, you can learn together too. Don't like, it's not all noise, but it is like the people who are talking the loudest sometimes have they're selling something, and you don't need to buy that.
Yeah. And I've been fortunate enough to like have you and Jesse Cannon to bounce all of my questions off of, whether it's Pro Tools or Logic. Here's the thing. There's no stupid question. I have asked you a lot of things that I feel like I should have been able to figure out having done this as long as I have. And I'm just like, oh yeah, I don't know every single little thing about Logic or Pro Tools because they both can do so many things. And as you've probably noticed, I run into the weirdest bugs sometimes, and you're like, I have no idea what this is.
Well, because I don't do anything. I basically do nothing. Like I'm getting this, like Pro Tools is hundreds of dollars software. And I'm getting probably like $40 out of this. Like what I'm doing with Pro Tools, we could do with GarageBand probably for the most part. Although I don't know if GarageBand is crossfading yet, but maybe it is. But like that's the thing, is like, I don't do a lot. You push yourself a little harder when you're dealing with these things, and I'm just turning knobs and just hoping it works out.
And sometimes it turns out your audio is just extra loud because the master fader accidentally got bumped up and you didn't realize it.
Yeah, you press the button, you press the key command, the hidden Pro Tools key command that just turns the master fader up to its maximum, or like deletes all your plugins or whatever. I've mixed shows before. Like, there's been stories where I've just mixed and then like I'll come back to it later and be like, oh my God, my levels are terrible. Like, why am I so short of the target? And I'll look and I'll see that the automation lane on the master fader is just completely like, oh, it like got bumped, or it's like been at a slope, where it's just been going down. So by the end of the story, it's just like, why is it like whispering to me now? Yeah. So there are no stupid questions. We all get like head scratchers and things like that. And weird problems that are truly just completely like anomalies. Like, we're just, like your audio will just disappear and your waveform will just be like upside down or split between two stereo tracks for some reason, and half of a stereo track is occupied. It doesn't matter. Sometimes your automation will be horizontal instead of vertical, or vice versa. Like, it'll just look completely not right. It's like, this is physically impossible what this automation lane is telling me right now. But yeah, it's nice to have people to talk to about it.
Gotta love the software. Well, Mike, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure, and we're under an hour, so we've broken a record. We've truly broken a record.